It's Get Out of Here. I'm Warren Levinson. Okay, this one's a little tricky. We're going to talk about Hong Kong. Now, anyone who's been paying the slightest bit of attention over the last 6 months knows that Hong Kong is in a struggle over the future it was promised when the Chinese government regained control of the territory 22 years ago. There are regular, large pro-democracy protests. Clashes between demonstrators and police are an almost daily occurrence. But Hong Kong, sophisticated, multicultural, unruly, noisy, lively, and beautiful Hong Kong remains open to visitors, though their numbers have been cut about in half in recent months. It'd be a little tone-deaf of us to suggest this is the time to go and to take advantage of the deals being offered by the tour companies, the hotels and restaurants that are scrambling to replace missing visitors. But it would also be wrong of us to tell you that a place as vast as Hong Kong is just closed. We talked with Associated Press Paris correspondent John Leicester, who's back from a recent reporting trip to the city, a place he knows very well. Hong Kong was John's first AP posting. He covered the years leading up to the British handover of the territory in 1997 and the years immediately afterward. Herewith, that conversation. Okay, so John Leicester, here's the deal about Hong Kong. We look at the newspapers from Hong Kong or whatever news there is, and it seems like an entire place that is completely, and it's certainly a very serious political crisis, but it also seems like an entire place that is convulsed with disorder. What is it really like to be there?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm going to give you two answers. I'm going to give you the answer of the responsible journalist who should tell you to be careful, and I'm going to give you the answer of somebody who's known Hong Kong since he was a young man, which is no longer the case anymore, and fell in love with the place basically from the very first time I went there. And that person's going to not be as responsible as the responsible journalist. So let's start with the responsible journalist. Now, there is a lot of disorder in Hong Kong, and some of it is very violent. So anybody who's thinking of going there needs to take the necessary precautions. Those first precaution I would suggest would be looking up your country's either foreign office or foreign ministry or State Department website and seeing what their latest advisory is, because you don't want to be caught out and I don't know, some development has happened in the situation in Hong Kong and maybe their travel advisory has changed. That's always a good place to start, I think, for anybody traveling anywhere, really. When you're there, you're going to find a city that, for all intents and purposes, in most of Hong Kong, looks fairly normal. But the trouble is you can never quite tell where things are going to go hairy, where the violence might suddenly pop up, because this is essentially, we're talking here about protests that are going violent. We're talking about, police chasing after protesters, so running down streets, firing tear gas and rubber bullets. And you don't want to be caught out. It's a very fluid situation, so you do have to be careful. That said, there's lots of parts of Hong Kong that aren't affected by the riots at all, and because so many people are staying away, it's in a strange sort of way almost an ideal time to visit. Places where normally you would have a very long line of people has nobody. Disneyland, for example. I mean, we spent an afternoon there, and you don't have any queues on any of the rides. You just get on, do the ride, get back on the ride, do it again and again and again. And, how often does that happen at Disneyland?
Well, hardly ever, although I will have to say, I can't imagine anybody from this country going to Hong Kong for Hong Kong Disney.
Okay, I take your point. I mean, one thing also that we haven't discussed yet, but we probably should, is the more sort of the moral question: should you go? Should you not go? I was quite interested actually, because when I was there for 3 weeks, very recently, covering the protests for the Associated Press, and one of the stories I wrote about was about tourism and how the impact on tourism there. And the story that I wrote, I thought was fairly balanced. I mean, it explained basically what I've just said, that, it is dangerous. It's very bad for people who are working in tourism. Obviously, if you run a hotel, if you run a restaurant, all the people who are dependent on the millions of people that come and now are staying away, then these are very painful times for them. But I did also point out that if you're a tourist who does come, that you're going to find some changes, in the sense that you're going to find some upsides too. And I was quite surprised by the reaction of some people who read that story and sort of criticized me, saying that that it was almost immoral that to suggest that this was a good time to go to Hong Kong. And I do take that point. I mean, I suppose you could say the same thing about people who go on holiday or go traveling rather to places like North Korea or other places. There's always the question of should you go? Now, I throw that out there just as a question. I'm not going to get into that. I think that's really a personal choice.
Right, but what do you think a tourist is saying politically, if anything, about I've decided that this is a time I want to go to Hong Kong?
Well, I actually did meet some tourists who had gone specifically because of the protests. People who felt that this is a key moment in history, in the history of China. We spoke to one person who'd come all the way over from South America. And he was saying, look, the last time something this big happened was Tiananmen Square in 1989, and that was a historical time. Now there are protests in Hong Kong, and I just come from Mexico, actually. Now I remember clearly, and had come over specifically to this, and he got off the plane. And when we talked to him, he was like, "Where are the protests?" We sort of directed him down the street. Just follow the smell of the tear gas. You'll find them pretty easily. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, I mean, it's these are personal choices. I don't know if I can weigh into whether you should or you shouldn't, but it is a momentous time in Hong Kong. It also, again, I think this has to be stressed. It's very fluid. I mean, the question that everybody's asking at the moment is, after protests are now in their 6th month. So the question is, at what point are the leaders in Beijing, the Chinese communist leaders, going to say enough is enough? And how might they react? Might there be another Tiananmen? Might they send in the army? I mean, these are questions that Hong Kong people are asking themselves too. And obviously, if you're a tourist, you don't want to be caught up, I wouldn't have thought, in that sort of event. And there's no guarantee that sort of event is not just around the corner. Nobody has that crystal ball. So those are all things that you need to sort of consider into making this decision about whether this is a good time to go.
There's also a question from a certain point of view that perhaps Hong Kong is an extraordinary place and it has this kind of freedom that you don't generally get in a police state, that because the possibility lurks that the government in Beijing might actually crack down, that we could be witnessing the last days of that Hong Kong. And you kind of want to, if you're interested, you might kind of want to see that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also an argument to say that, okay, I mean, for instance, we went up to the Peak, which is one of the, must-visit sites for Hong Kong. The view, this is on Hong Kong Island, and the view of Hong Kong from there is absolutely knockout. I mean, the skyscrapers at night all lit up with their neon, and it's sort of Blade Runner sort of view, really, and just spectacular view all the way into the hills that are leading towards China. And normally there would be queues maybe 2-3 hours long just to get on the Peak tram, which is a rickety old tram that dates back to the last century, to get up there. And there'd be queues at the top. Well, now there's nobody on the Peak tram. And when you get up there, the restaurants that have these spectacular views, I mean, we spoke to restaurateurs there, they had not a single person there. And, saying that if this carries on, then they're going to have to shut down. So, by going and spending your tourist dollars, your tourist euros or whatever it is, you are helping Hong Kong people sort of maybe, make ends meet during a very difficult time. I suppose that there's that consideration too.
Right. As entirely aside from the politics, you are supporting people's livelihoods. So there's that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
This is Get Out of Here, the AP Travel Podcast. I'm Warren Levinson, talking with AP correspondent John Leicester, who recently visited Hong Kong, one of many trips he's taken. And we'll be back with more, including what makes Hong Kong such a special place for John Leicester, right after this. It's Get Out of Here, the AP Travel Podcast, talking with John Leicester about Hong Kong. So you said at the outset, John, you fell in love with Hong Kong years ago. So what is it about Hong Kong that draws you back?
Well, this is radio, so thankfully it's not video, because if it was, you would have noticed that I came back from Hong Kong with a slightly broader waistline than I had when I first went there. My wife noticed it straight away when I came back. The food has to be top of the list. I think not maybe right at the very top, but pretty much close to the top. Hong Kong is just a great place to just eat to your heart's content, and that's part of the pleasure, I think, of going there. The skyline, the urban environment of Hong Kong, it's sort of like Manhattan. If you imagine Manhattan sort of scrumpled, take Manhattan in your hand, scrumple it all up like a little ball, and then you've kind of got Hong Kong, basically. I mean, the canyons there of skyscrapers feel even more canyony than they do in, say, Manhattan. The urban sort of squeeze, everybody's squeezed together. When I was there as a young reporter, I wrote a story once about how when I was in my kitchen, I could literally reach out through the window of my kitchen and take the food out of the wok of my neighbor's kitchen, which was right next door. I mean, with a pair of chopsticks, I could have stolen his whole lunch. And everybody is on top of each other, and that's an incredible feeling too. I kind of love that. Maybe not to live, but to visit, it's quite something. It's also a maritime city. It was a port. It was valuable to the British when they took it over as a colony, because it was a port. So it was a gateway into China. And that sort of mixture of urban plus, the boats that you have right there. Everything from big ocean liners to the little Hong Kong Star Ferry, which has not changed. The beautiful old diesel ferry that zips back and forth across from Kowloon back to Hong Kong Island, with the sailors who run that in their very traditional sailors' uniforms. That's a real pleasure too. And then you've got, certain sites, obviously the Peak, I mentioned that, fabulous views, incredible views. There's the giant Buddha on Lantau Islands. That's another place where there's been really no process at all. Again, a huge, gigantic Buddha that people like to climb up and have a view over to Macau, another former colony that used to be Portuguese, and then over the South China Sea. And it's just, it's also, if you like to shop, then you can shop till you drop, and in Hong Kong too. And it is true that because of the disruption to tourism, I mean, hotels are ridiculously cheap at the moment. The numbers of tourists has been halved. So some of the hotels are offering just ridiculous deals. I spoke to a South African couple, it's a brother and sister, and they were visiting, and the gentleman was telling me that when he booked his hotel a few months ago, the room was 2,000 Hong Kong dollars a night. So that's, let me think, I think something around, about 200 US, something like that maybe. Right. But anyway, when he actually got round to paying the bill, it was actually $500 a night. So it was a quarter of what he'd expected to pay, because the hotel had just slashed prices so much to try and keep people, coming.
Right. So you might feel a little like a vulture and taking advantage of unrest, but on the other hand, there's something about really low prices that is attractive, especially in a place so steeped in views and history.
Yeah. Now, the vulture thing, like I said before, I absolutely take that point. I can see where people might feel that way. I'm not sure that that's how Hong Kong people feel. Can't tell you the number of times that people thanked me for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to see us. Thank you. Tell the world what's happening here. Not once did anybody say, look, can't you see how serious this is? What do you think you're doing here? Obviously, I was there as a journalist, not as a tourist. But my sense was very much people in Hong Kong do not want to be forgotten. They don't want to become a backwater of China. So that vulture idea, I don't think is one that you'll meet when you're there.
And when you said at the beginning, as a responsible journalist, I would tell you if you're coming here, you need to take precautions. What sort of precautions are we talking about?
Well, I think staying abreast of the situation is very, very important. You want to be reading the newspapers in the morning as you're having your breakfast, just to see, where are the protests expected, where might they be. For example, the weekends tend to be when protests are concentrated. Well, you might want to think about staying away from the very center of Hong Kong during those times. There was one day, for example, when I was covering a protest, and this was in the center of Hong Kong, on Hong Kong Island, and I had my tear gas mask on, I had my goggles, my helmet, and it was really quite hairy. Bricks being thrown by the protesters, fire, petrol, gasoline bombs, and then you had police firing tear gas the other way, and it becomes a sort of cat and mouse chase where the police are chasing after protesters, firing tear gas as they go, and they ran straight headlong into a bunch of tourists who happened to be drinking beers and all the rest of it. And I saw couples with young babies in prams running as fast as they could to get out of this choking tear gas. And I wouldn't say I can't imagine that's a pleasurable experience for anybody. So you really want to be careful about where you're going to be when. But then again, I'm sure that this is something that your hotel could help you with. Talk to them in the morning. You need to really keep your ear to the ground. And there are many places in Hong Kong that are not affected by these protests. The islands, for example, met some tourists I was talking to who said that they'd spent the weekends, they'd been there for over a week, I think it was. And they had basically decided that during the week they would visit the Hong Kong island and some of its sites. But at the weekends they would get out of town and go and visit the islands. There's some beautiful little islands that are well worth visiting, and where there haven't been any protests.
Right, I wanted to talk about that, about the islands, the quiet fishing villages, the places, because we focus so much on the center of Hong Kong. Are these places that are really beautiful and tranquil unto themselves, or are they just beautiful and tranquil compared to the urban environment that you're getting away from?
No, they're fabulous. Really, if you get from central Hong Kong, there's all sorts of little ferries that run regularly. I'm talking sort of every 20 minutes, 30 minutes, that will take you off to any number of these small islands. And they're a world in a world. They're completely different from the craziness of Hong Kong, and yes, very much more the sort of traditional South China Sea little fishing village sort of thing. There are some beautiful country parks as well in Hong Kong where the fabulous hiking to be done too. So yes, everybody wants to see the big skyscrapers, the urbanness of Hong Kong, the shopping, all those things. The malls that seem to never go to sleep. Those types of things. The food, but there are so many little hidden gems in Hong Kong off the beaten track. I suppose that's true everywhere, but you take a little ferry, so maybe a half an hour ride. You've got the sea. You get there and you just have a wander around these little villages and hop back on, and you're back in town again. So it's definitely worth doing.
Wow, it does seem great, John Leicester. I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been just terrific.
That's a real pleasure.
John Leicester, an AP reporter and columnist based in Paris, is back from a reporting trip to Hong Kong. We spoke before the confrontations between police and protesters moved into the city's universities. The State Department recommends Americans who travel to Hong Kong exercise increased caution. It doesn't recommend that they don't go. And now, my favorite trip. If you were listening last week, and if you weren't, you can put this show on pause and go back and download it. That's okay. We'll wait. Anyway, if you were listening last week, you heard the AP's Courtney Bonnell talk about what she learned about traveling alone on a recent trip to Barcelona. This week, another perspective on solo travel. Patty Sullivan, a retired screenwriter who decided after the breakup of a 26-year relationship that not having a traveling companion was no reason to keep her home, she went to Rwanda last month to see the gorillas described by the late primate researcher Dian Fossey.
I decided I really wanted to see the silverback gorillas. I knew it was a real big hike to get there. And I figured, before I get much older, I'm 64, I should do this now. So I took a flight, and I had I arranged for one guy to drive me around. And we became very close. That's one thing that, Michael Crichton wrote about this in a really interesting way. He wrote the book Travels. Did you ever read Travels? No? Okay. Well, it's travel inward and travel outward. He does one with direct experience with nature and another with direct experience with, say, swimming with sharks or whatever. And one would be meditating with a cactus in the desert. But since I read that book, I started to understand the significance of being alone in the world by yourself, your own spirit, your own everything. And so I went to Rwanda, and I was by myself, and I was told to get ready to do the climb. And the trek is forever. It takes hours and hours to get up to the rainforest. And I was up where Dian Fossey had her place, and her grave is up there. And you walk, and as you're walking for 4 hours in mudslides vertically, you really put to the test your body. And there's a way in which it's just you. You can't. There's no one to bitch at, or there's no one to say, "God damn it, why did we choose to do this?" There's none of that. It's just, I'm in this. These are the elements. I'm in. Go with it. And you go, and finally, when we got up to where the gorillas were, it was extraordinary. I saw them. And I was very close to them. You're not allowed to touch them because we share 98% of our DNA with them. You can give them a flu, cold, anything like that. But to look at them and to look at their faces and what beautiful beasts they are in this setting that is so off the grid, it blew my heart open. And I stood there, and I felt like, oh my God, like my heart is going to explode. Like, these things are so beautiful, and that I am so privileged that I get to come here and look them in the eye and watch their babies swing with them and the mothers breastfeed. And then, Dian Fossey had created the way to speak with them, and she lived with them, as you know, for years, and she broke down all of their behaviors. And so when you go, the trackers which go up with you, they have a language with them that Dian Fossey taught them. And so you go near them and you go like, and that's telling them everything's going to be okay. This is good. And then they go, and you're like, I'm talking with a gorilla. It's like so amazing. And they're beautiful, and they're playful, and they're fun. And it wasn't mediated by anybody else's needs. I had my own connection to them. And I didn't have a partner like, oh, are you too wet? Oh, are you getting a cold? Oh, you have to go sit down. It was like my spirit was there with their spirit.
Patty Sullivan is a retired screenwriter. She lives in New Jersey. And that's the show. Get Outta Here is a production of the Associated Press and Westwood One, produced under the supervision of Nikessa Moody and Peter Costanzo. I'm Warren Levinson. We'll see you next time.